Welcome to PacWest Magazine, the radio show. The show about our exciting Pacific West Conference. The PacWest is made up of NCAA Division II universities from Arizona and Utah to California and Hawaii. It's the most beautiful and diverse athletic conference in the entire NCAA. This is Commissioner Bob Hogue, inviting you to join our outstanding coaches, student athletes, and administrators as we talk about the great excitement in the PacWest. Now here's Assistant Commissioner Tom Camillo, live from our studios in Santan, Arizona.
I'm so glad we're not floating away today, Joe.
Oh, yeah. No, we're doing all right today. But they're going to be, I think the Storms are going to be back with a vengeance, you?
From what I saw this coming weekend,
is that right?
They're going to come back. We talked about, we are in the KQCK studios in the Santan Valley, and we always talk about how hot it is during the summer months, and we're out in the desert, and our Commissioner Bob Hogue has been in the studio, and it's just an awesome studio. But earlier this week, those storms that hit the Santan Valley area, Joe has a wash, and I just went outside here to take a look at what you were talking about. It really cut through your property right up against the building.
What made me the most nervous was, and I'm so glad I just had my roof rebuilt, I was worried, maybe a leak. Because, in
the studio,
we had hail the size of big marbles.
You guys get hail out here more often than like down where I live, which isn't too far away.
I'm talking, I have it on video. We're like 3 inches on the ground. It was like, wow, but it melted so quick, but it was still pretty awesome.
It's I know
you knocking people down.
Oh, you throw a marble from an airplane and kill somebody, right? So, but it's we're glad the studio's still intact, and I noticed you did some work with a bobcat to get back over to your house. And people listening probably don't know the way the property's set up, but this building where we're at is toward the front of the entrance, and that's where the studio is. And then your parents' place is right adjacent to the studio. Did they have any damage?
Yeah, no. You just the normal. We have some outbuildings and stuff. Lost a piece of, metal off one roof, and this thing here and that thing there.
That's typical stuff. But
right.
You actually had a huge stream going down. You said it was going about 40 miles an hour.
I tried to throw. I thought maybe some salmon were going to be migrating through it, so I tried to throw a lure in there, but nothing. I did catch a cold.
But you couldn't get in or out of your property, right?
No, absolutely not.
And it took out the fence. So
it didn't, and I didn't have the nerve to just try to run across it because I knew it would have definitely swept me away.
Wow, that's well, we're glad we're here. We're glad we're on the air because we have a special guest with us. It's going to be joining us shortly. Jane Texera from the Pacific West Conference. She is the Assistant Commissioner for Compliance, and she's going to talk about today about what compliance is, how it impacts the NCAA, obviously, but how it impacts Division II and also the Pacific West Conference. And it's one of those subjects that a lot of people hear in the news. Obviously, the big thing with Penn State, the NCAA came down, which was a little different scenario. But you hear some of the institutions around the country, the big Division I's, always there's a violation, there's sanctions. And the NCAA rules are across the board. Now there are specific rules for Division I, II, and III, but the NCAA oversees the rules for all levels. And schools, institutions, and conferences are also responsible for self-policing and taking a look at the what's going on in the conference. And sometimes people violate rules inadvertently. Some of the rules are there, and people think that they're archaic or ridiculous. And while that may be true, there's always a reason why some of that stuff was put in place, because somebody somewhere was taking an advantage or trying to take an advantage. But the rules have become more streamlined and federated over the years at the Division I, II, and III level. So it makes sense where a Division II or III school doesn't have some of the same type of things that a Division I institution might have. So they really try to make the actions appropriate for those institutions. And joining us is Jane Texera, the Assistant Commissioner for Compliance with the Pacific West Conference, and she's in Newport Beach, California. Jane, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. How are you guys doing?
Good. Jane, well, first of all, you're an Arizona native.
Yes, I am, from Tucson, Arizona.
And where did you go to high school?
When I was 3.
Where did you go to high school in Tucson?
I went to Santa Rita High School, home of the Fighting Eagles.
And then you played softball and went on to the University of Texas, correct?
That is correct. Played softball at the University of Texas at Austin, helped start that team, and went on to the World Series. in our second year of existence. Great experience.
And your head coach was Connie Clark, correct?
Correct. Another Arizona native.
Yes.
Look at you.
Yeah, she's actually a graduate of Central Arizona College right here in Pinell County. And
that's right.
So you have the experience of not just being a compliance officer and handling those duties from the standpoint of somebody coming in, for lack of a better term, an adult in a career that learned this. But you were a student athlete, so you actually had to live this as a student athlete. So you have two perspectives on this.
Correct. I think it's important to be able to relate to the student athletes you work with and understand that it's not an easy job to do, so to speak. They say, all you do is play sports and go to school, but you learn a lot about time management, and your time is not your own. While some of your friends or classmates are off having jobs and going to events at night, you are either studying or preparing for a contest or practicing or in the training room or weight room trying to get better for the next competition.
Now let's talk about compliance in general and your role in the PacWest. First of all, compliance really gets a bad name. It seems like, when you talk about conference expansion, you talk about success of student athletes, you talk about schools doing great things with grade point averages in the student athlete. They're all positive things that come out of that and are publicized in the media and on websites. But it seems like in terms of compliance, the only thing that ever happens that's public is always a negative thing. And it kind of gets a bad rap, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Unfortunately, as a compliance person, you are, so to speak, protector of the institutions and your coaches and your student athletes when it comes to the NCAA rules and legislation. You want to make sure that not only are your student athletes being taken care of or not being taken advantage of, or prospective student athletes, but you also want to make sure your coaches are doing right by those student athletes and the institutions. And you also want to protect them from, again, those big publicized issues that happen. Sometimes that does not happen. You can only know what you know, but you have to do a good job of trying to make sure that you're on the forefront of issues and trying to help coaches and institutions do what they want to do within the parameters of the legislation. So yes, we're protectors, but we also are big supporters of our institutions and of our student athletes that we work with.
I think the big question is, and I always say there's a little misconception, a lot of people will blame the NCAA for when they come down with sanctions and come up with violations. But the NCAA really isn't just a bunch of people that work at a building in Indianapolis. The NCAA is made up, and all the rules committees and all these committees that operate are really ADs and athletic administrators and presidents across the country. It's not people in a building making these rules up. It's really the whole membership that makes its own rules, isn't it?
That's correct. The whole idea behind the NCAA is the membership puts forward legislation, and sometimes that legislation can come from within inside the NCAA, but it's usually at the directive of a particular committee that you may have heard about or seen on the news, and they put forward legislation that is voted on and approved by the membership of the NCAA. The NCAA is a voluntary organization, so institutions do not have to belong to it if they don't want to. But also the NCAA, the idea of those individuals in Indianapolis making the rules and setting the precedents and things like that, they're just sort of like the Supreme Court of our organization. So it is their job to enforce, to protect, and to sometimes levy penalties on institutions so that there's a playing field that is level and competitiveness that is fair.
So there's a really basic question. Why have rules? And that seems like a silly question, but probably in the public are like, well, why do we even bother having rules?
That is true. I've heard that question before, and my best answer for that is without rules, you could never have a fair and competitive fairness for student athletes, for institutions that have money versus institutions that don't have money. Where do you draw the line? Again, that line is blurred at times because, again, there are times when you have institutions that have a lot of money that can do a lot of different things compared to institutions that don't. However, you have to have a line. If we didn't have stoplights or rules of the road, who knows what would be happening? So it's kind of that idea. Amateur sports is amateur sports for a reason, and you do need some type of insulation from it to differentiate it from professional sports.
So everybody that's a member of the NCAA, institutions that are accepted, institutions that have been there a long time, they all know what they're getting into to be a member of this organization, is that there are rules and you need to follow them.
Correct. Correct. Again, the benefits, and people often hear this, Tom, also is where do they get it? Where do they spend all their money on? Where does the NCAA get all this money from the men's March Madness and the basketball tournaments? Well, the good thing about the NCAA, they put so much money back into the institutions that March Madness that everybody loves funds all the championships at all divisions for the entire NCAA. So one championship in one sport funds every championship opportunity for every student athlete in all three divisions. So they do a great job of putting that back into the institutions. And again, it is a business, so they're going to have to make sure they're insulated as far as being able to provide for staff and travel and things like that for those student athletes and their personnel. But they do a great job of making sure that that money goes back into the institutions and the people who need it and need it to provide great opportunities for student athletes.
How many championships are there at the NCAA level? You know, is it in the
That's a great
70s,
question.
70s, 80s, in that range?
70 to 80, approximately. And then they just add an additional, with the addition of women's sand volleyball, that will be a full-time sport here in the next couple of years, so that championship will be taking place soon, too.
So you look at everything from Division III women's tennis to Division I baseball and in Division II men's golf or indoor track and field. All those championships are funded from that big pool of money that the Division I men's basketball tournament gets.
Correct.
So
Correct.
that's so I had an athletic director one time say about compliance, and he was very, very, very good on compliance, made sure that they followed the rules, but he said, if you're not violating something, because a lot of times there's so many rules you inadvertently don't know. He said you should be checking yourself. He said if you don't come up with something and self-report, that you probably are not doing a good job of checking yourself. Would you agree with a statement like that?
Yes, I would agree with that statement. On average, the NCAA has said that on average an institution will report approximately 20 violations a year. And there are times that the book is 300, 400 pages long. You can't possibly know everything all the time. But again, you have to do the best job that you can do to make sure that you aren't making mistakes. Mistakes happen, and that's what they are. They are mistakes, and they are something that you need to report and deal with the consequences. And a lot of times those consequences are not as bad as everybody believes they will be. But you will get to the cases that we've seen lately in the press that they can become huge issues for institutions, such as the Penn State or the Miami cases that were just recently publicized, or even the North Carolina cases that have been publicized. So yes, they can become big issues, but mistakes happen. Everyone's human. But the idea behind it is you got to make sure that if you're not filing or reporting violations, then you're not doing a very good job as an institution. The NCAA will come in and actually look to see how many violations an institution has reported. If an institution hasn't reported enough, whatever that number may be, they may launch an investigation to see if you actually are monitoring and having institutional control over your athletics department. And at times that has happened.
You just mentioned a phrase there, institutional control, and that seems to come with a lot of terms of when the NCAA comes in, that you hear that cited often. Can you explain to listeners that maybe don't understand that term? That seems to be the crux of almost every kind of violation, or maybe the premise of the whole rule book. Explain what that, when they talk about institutional control, what does that really mean?
Institutional control in the eyes of the NCAA means everybody from the top down, from the presidents down to the janitors, are responsible for NCAA compliance with all the rules. So no matter whether or not you are a faculty member, or if you're the janitor, or if you are a student athlete or a coach, if you see a possible violation, you are responsible to tell the appropriate authority about that possible violation. It is the job of the institution to, quote-unquote, control those aspects of their program. So being able to control whether or not the violation happened, or putting in place parameters so that they could make sure those violations don't happen in the future. So it's a joint responsibility. It's not just a responsibility of the compliance department or the athletic department. It's a responsibility of every single individual who's associated with an institution. And oftentimes, Tom, as you know, it's even a responsibility of the conference office. If I, as a conference office staff member, see something, I have a job and a duty to report that to the appropriate individual, whether that be an institutional person for that of that institution, or even the NCAA. So it's a broad charge to the institutions and the presidents, all the way down again to the janitors or field maintenance people.
That I know that there's sometimes that people that are quote unquote whistleblowers are perceived that way, that might be employees, but they might not be connected with the athletic department. But if they see something, because they're part of an institution, they're bound to ask that question, or at least say, "Hey, I saw something funny. Does that make sense?" I mean, that's the responsibility and part of being a member of the NCAA.
That is correct. That is correct. I did deal with a case one time where I had a security person stop me and say, "Hey, I saw a student athlete doing X with this particular person. I'm not sure that particular person should be someone they're talking to." Turns out that with the case, it turned out that that particular person was an agent. So it was an ability for us to be able to stop a possible bigger violation than what it turned out to be. So it was very appreciative of that security person telling me of that particular interaction, but it could have been a lot bigger. So the idea is to try to, quote unquote, nip it in the bud before it becomes such a big issue as we've seen publicized lately.
You've been at Division I. I know you were at USC. You've been in Division II. What are the biggest differences in your experiences, and not so much the violations, but just kind of the procedures and the level of compliance, the manpower it takes from a Division I institution to like a Division II conference like the PacWest is?
I think the biggest difference is in the philosophies of the Division I and Division II. Both obviously want to make us. However, at Division II, the philosophy is work-life or school-life balance, as athletics being an integral part of a student-athlete's experience at an institution. Or at Division I, that still is true, but it is, again, mostly a business-centered idea. Student-athletes at Division II have more flexibility in the things they can and cannot do versus being able to be a part of a certain institutional group for, club or things like that, where at Division I, your time is so stretched that may not be a possibility. So those are big, huge differences at D1, D2. People think obviously money versus not as much money. But we have student athletes who are playing in the pros. A lot of NFL players come from Division II institutions. We have just as many successful student athletes off the field and off the court as Division I. It's just a different philosophy of having a well-rounded student athlete or student experience at Division II versus Division I, which again is more centralized, more business-focused, more Division I, chasing the mighty dollar focused, and putting out a good product.
How does compliance work at a conference level for like a Division II conference like the PacWest is? How does it all work?
Well, my job as a conference compliance liaison is to help and assist institutions who are members of the PacWest and members of the NCAA to make decisions on what is permissible, what is not permissible from a particular case or particular legislative point of view, and also help them be able to insulate themselves or put best practices or ideas in place to help them better insulate themselves from violations happening or being able to report those violations. So from a compliance standpoint, a conference office, I'm kind of a support staff person to our institutions. Conference offices cannot determine whether or not a violation has actually taken place at an institution. Now, we can point them in that direction and tell them, hey, I think this is a violation, but it is purely a advisory opinion, so it is totally up to the institution as per NCAA rules to decide whether or not a violation has taken place. Now, we could make that determination through the NCAA, but that is a different process. So as my job, I'm here to support and be a resource to my institutions and to help them make the best decisions they can for the cases that they're dealing with.
And when somebody's with a school, when they get hit with a violation, and let's just say it's a, lack of a better term, common run-of-the-mill, not what you're seeing in like some of the big schools with their football and basketball programs that we've seen, but something that was an inadvertent mistake. An athlete maybe was labeled as eligible and really didn't have all the paperwork in. They were ineligible for a game or two. What kind of happens? Can you kind of take us through the process? What does a school do? They self-report? Then the NCAA, do they impose their own recommendations for sanctions? How does that all work?
That's a great question, and it's good to know that a lot of institutions will actually do just that. What happens in the process is an institution will, let's use your example of the student-athlete didn't have the proper paperwork filed, or they misstated their eligibility, for instance. They thought they were eligible when, in fact, they were ineligible, and they played in a couple of games for whatever reason. So immediately the institution, once determining a violation has taken place, would have to declare that student-athlete ineligible. So once they do that, they would either seek to have that student-athlete reinstated by the NCAA if deemed necessary by the NCAA rules, and they would file a violation report. When they file that violation report, it sometimes comes to me or sometimes it goes directly to the NCAA, depending on the severity of the violation. Once it gets to the NCAA will look at that violation report and will and can accept any penalties that the institution has imposed. Most of the time, institutions will look at case precedent, and there's a database for that, and they will see what appropriate penalties are, and they will impose them on themselves. And the NCAA, 9 times out of 10, will accept those. There are those cases that the NCAA will say, no, that's not enough, and you need to add these additional elements as a penalty. So that happens additionally with a violation report. Through the reinstatement process, once the institution has declared that student-athlete ineligible, the NCAA student-athlete reinstatement staff will again look at the case, look at the violation, and determine how much of that violation was the fault of the student-athlete, or was it the fault of somebody else. So in your case, student-athlete was deemed eligible when they in fact were ineligible. How much of that was the student-athlete's fault? If that tips in favor of the student-athlete not being in fault, they will reinstate that student-athlete and may have minimal penalties. If they find out that that student-athlete, for instance, didn't file the appropriate paperwork or should have done some other step in order to make sure they were eligible, that may well be a harsher penalty, so additional games or whatever it may be. So the student-athlete reinstatement staff does take into account all of those factors when they're looking at eligibility statuses and reinstatement of student-athletes. But the violation report in and of itself comes from the enforcement staff, and it's based on precedent that's happened in the past.
We're speaking with Jane Texera from the Pacific West Conference, the conference office. She's the assistant commissioner for compliance. And Jane, can you explain to the listeners the term redshirting and how it's different, or how, in terms of eligibility, the number of years student athletes can compete, Division II compared to Division III compared to Division I, because there are differences.
Correct. That's a great question. So let's first start with the definition of eligibility, or the time you have to actually compete. At Division I runs off a 5-year clock. So what that means is that a student, when they first enroll full-time at any institution, collegiate institution, whether it be a junior college, Division I, II, or III, or NAIA institution, when they enroll full-time, their 5-year period of eligibility begins to run. So let's say you enrolled in fall of 2005 at Central Arizona College. You would have until spring of 2010 to complete your eligibility. So you would have 5 years in which to get 4 seasons of competition in. That clock continues to run whether or not you're enrolled full-time, part-time, not enrolled at all, and there are very limited ways to toll that clock. Versus at Division II or Division III, those are more flexible. Division II and Division III, although it essentially is the same, the flexibility is that you have 10 full-time semesters in which to get your 4 seasons of eligibility in. So again, it's still 5 years if you go full-time 2 semesters every academic calendar, but you can go in the fall full-time, and that counts as one of your 10, and go in the spring part-time, and that doesn't count against your 10 full-time semesters. So there's different ways to manipulate your eligibility based on what you want to do at Division II and Division III versus Division I.
When I was at Westchester, we had a swimmer. She swam, I think it was Georgia or Georgia Tech. She was in her early 30s, but she graduated and got her degree 10 years before that, and then decided, came back to the area, decided later in life wanted to get her teaching degree, and had a year of eligibility. So she wasn't eligible to go back and swim or compete. She had a year of eligibility at the Division II level because she had only gone to school 8 semesters. but she couldn't go back at Division I because her clock would have expired, correct?
That is correct. That is correct.
So that goes back to, so that's really, it's a great flexibility for Division II student athletes. When you look at, in general, some of the violations that you have to deal with or that you experience at the sort of the Division II level, is there really one that people trip over a lot because they're just not aware of it, or it's just one that you see repeatedly, or a few that you see repeatedly?
This particular instance that I'm thinking of happens a lot of Division I now. When I mention it, it's interesting because D2 has just now changed the rule. They did back in January. They changed the rule, but the telephone call to prospective student athletes, the one phone call per week that everyone hears about, that happens a lot at Division I, and it happens a lot due to maybe just misidentification of a student athlete, prospective student athlete as being phone call eligible, so to speak. Versus at D2, the hope is with the deregulation of that rule, D2 has gone to, as of June 15th, after a prospective student athlete's sophomore year in high school, they can be contacted unlimited form, time, mode, versus D1 where those rules are still in place. So I think that's probably the biggest rule that's broken inadvertently, with our technology, which is why D2 has changed the rule, is technology has caught up, has surpassed where that rule was when it was first implemented. It was first implemented because there used to only be one telephone in the whole household. Now you've got multiple telephones in the household, you've got cell phones, you've got the internet. So there's been other abilities to contact student athletes, and be frank that with technology of text messaging and Facebook and all those other social media aspects, there are individuals out there and kids out there that they just don't want to talk on the phone. So the NCAA has decided, and particularly Division II, to take that into account and to move with the times and help reflect that technology change. So that's probably the biggest one that's broken at Division I, and not so much hopefully now with the change in legislation at D2.
To even sort of do compliance and manage that with social media and texting and email, it's almost, it'd be astronomical amount of time trying to log and monitor something like that. Correct.
And there was a lot of businesses out there that toted recruiting software that did just that helped manage that for individuals in compliance by putting together databases and having apps on their smartphones and being able to log into the website to see a particular age of a prospective student athlete. Now, again, all of that's good and dandy, but it's only as good as the information that it's put into it. So if the information is inputted incorrectly, then you're going to have violations no matter what you try to do to follow the rules. So there are many recruiting softwares out there that help compliance individuals with that information, and it does take a tremendous amount of time because you still have to analyze it. It puts it in one nice little form, but you still have to look at it and spend time going over it and cross-checking. So the hope with the Division II is that they've eliminated some of that with the deregulation of the telephone contact rules.
Jane, our 30 minutes have flown by, and we really appreciate you joining us. We'd love to have you on again because there's a lot of fascinating subjects, especially for parents and student athletes that listen to the program, to really get a perspective on how all this works.
Yes, for sure. Anytime. Happy to help. Glad to have been here.
So
we'd
love to have you in the studio next time you're home visiting Tucson, too.
For sure. I want to see the corgis.
There you go.
All right.
Jane has corgis.
That is fantastic. I love corgis.
So
yes.
So
they made their debut in the Olympic ceremonies this past Friday.
That's right, they did.
Wow. Hey, we're looking for a little male. I may have to call you.
Okay. I have two of them.
There you go. So, all right, Jane Teixeira from the Pacific West Conference, Assistant Commissioner for Compliance. Thanks, Jane, for joining us. And a subject matter that's not overly popular at times because it always seems like it's the law coming down, but it's actually fascinating, and there's a lot of reasons why compliance exists, and Jane does a terrific job for the conference. So, Joe, we're going to catch you next week. We're inching closer to the start of the PacWest seasons here at the end of August. Yep, and with our 4 new schools, so it's going to be an exciting time. So, for Joe Carrera, I'm Tom D. Camillo. We'll catch you next Thursday on PacWest Radio.
Hi, this is Daniel, your host for Rock and Roll 101.